In this lecture, we're going to talk about African art. Starting with Africa, we need to establish it is a large continent. It is not a singular country. It has many countries, and it's a variety of cultures. Oftentimes throughout history, but particularly with our conversation with art, Africa is disregarded as being less advanced or primitive, often being totally excluded from the art history canon because it's predominantly hyper-focused on Western art ideals and aesthetics. Moving forward, we just need to recognize that societies all develop differently. And art is no different. The culture that creates the artwork is going to be reflected within the style, function, and aesthetic of the work itself. And just because the institution controlling the narrative, a la the Western canon, does not accept something, that's not directly indicative of lesser technologies or lesser culture or lesser art by any means. So moving on to the artwork itself, throughout Africa we see terracotta, which is unglazed reddish earthenware. So within this time period, we don't necessarily see the modeling technique of creating a sculpture wherein the artist is building onto an armature or sculpting from the clay itself. Instead, the artists are actually letting the clay harden a little bit and dry out so that they can carve into it, doing a subtractive process rather than additive, which is actually very similar in technique to wood carving. This terracotta example really exemplifies themes we're going to see throughout West Africa. It has really detailed figures, but there's definitely a degree of abstraction. This figure is also actually one of the oldest examples of African art. Even though their artwork goes back much farther, there's not much evidence of it because of the perishable media that they used. But this example here is actually contemporary to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Next we have Yoruba, which is modern-day Nigeria. And these people were creating naturalistic styles of portraiture, utilizing primarily the technique of bronze lost wax casting. Formerly, these works really utilized lines, and they did so by creating grooves in the surface, emphasizing the facial contours and planes. Many bronze sculptures, like the one we see here, had rows of holes, like we see in this example along the hairline, and they were meant to hold garments. We assume that this one actually held a beaded veil to the form. Wood carvings in Yoruba are often seen in architectural supports, like embellished columns on buildings. Many times these columns actually utilized figural forms in their designs. While the actual meaning and purpose of these different designs were really contingent on the location, subject matter, and style, they often represented a social hierarchy, like we see in this example, house post. We can also see the utilization of primacy of place, which is where the higher someone is, the more important that they are. And in the bottom example, we see an actual installation of these house posts. Moving on to Benin, we see more bronze-casted sculptures. While influenced by the artwork coming out of Nigeria, these sculptures actually had a more abstract approach, particularly compared to the male portrait head that we saw in Ivory, Nigeria. It was much more naturalistic. Benin bronze sculptures were also exclusively reserved for representing royalty or other distinguished ancestors. Next, we're going to look at Benin ivory carving, which we see an example of here. It was a popular art form in Western Africa. Similar to the styles of the bronze casting techniques, we see an abstraction and a diversion from naturalistic styles. Looking particularly at the medium itself, ivory carvings actually had the capability of being inlaid with metal. Benin ivory carvings also utilized a lot of elements of symbolism, which we can see in this example here. It depicts a queen, but the crown on her head made up of mudfish and human forms, which represents the Portuguese traders and sailors with whom these people traded. These kinds of pendants are actually still worn by the Oba, or the ruler, on his chest or at his waist during ceremonies. Looking at Mali, we see that they're renowned for their intricate wood carvings. Primarily, we see this in chiwaras, which are ritual antelope figures used in Mali culture. The example that we see pictured here is actually used in agricultural ceremonies. Stylistically, they're very abstracted with rhythmic curves that are then accented by few straight lines. There's also an interplay of solid mass and negative space being utilized in these forms. Oftentimes, chiwara headdresses are actually worn with basketry caps that are draped down the wearer. In Cameroon, the sculptures actually represent the human form in ways that are far more abstracted than both Yoruba and Benin. We can see in this example here that while it's still very humanoid and does read as a face, the features are much more exaggerated and abstracted. This stylistically was developed in the royal courts and actually served more functional purposes, like being used for royal festivals and in spiritual ceremonies, rather than just as monuments for rulers. The Congo also utilizes artwork with functional purposes, and they're really important to daily life rather than just being visual. The sculpture that we see here actually exemplifies the functionality of Congolese art. This piece was actually used whenever a civil case was concluded, a treaty was ratified, or a law was enacted. Upon such a legal milestone, tribal members would drive a piece of metal into the statue, signifying the strength of the agreement that was made. In this way, the figure itself personifies the force of justice and order. Also in the Congo, we see textiles like cut pile embroidery, which is actually one of Africa's oldest traditions, and it was predominantly used as skirts for women. Formally speaking, the diagonals in the pattern gather strength and overlay the square pattern. In the tradition of making, the men would actually weave the stretch of cloth using raffia fibers. After this, women would go in and embroider these fibers by lacing in dyed strips throughout the warps and wefts of the loom, and then they weave in strands of cloth back and forth out of the top side. These exposed fibers are actually trimmed to the approximate height and feel of velvet, giving it a similar look and texture. In Ghana, we have the kente cloth, which is a patterned textile that's hand-woven with thin pieces of cotton and silk. Textile arts in Ghana were highly developed by the Ashanti people. They used looms to weave narrow strips of cloth together, creating patterns that often symbolized important proverbs or cultural ideas. As a result, weaving was a public art form, and it was used as a way to visually communicate. The image that we see here was used to communicate unprecedented historical events, or events that had never happened before, such as when Kwame Nkrumah won the national elections, establishing Ghana as an independent country. African art wasn't just localized to its own country. It really had a substantial influence on global artists. Beyond the spiritual influences, there was also major inspiration in aesthetics and styles. Throughout different locations and time periods, we have seen the abstraction of the human figure and facial features, primarily using geometric forms, the concept of fragmentation, and the relationship between masks and facial features. These stylistic choices affected major artists like Picasso and Matisse, and others who attended the School of Paris, but these elements were hugely influential on Cubism. We can see an example of this starting to begin with Picasso's Gertrude Stein portrait. The eye shape and dimensionality is really reflective of this Nigerian portrait. So while some artists were really regarding the stylistic advances and beauty of African works, other artists, historians, and critics were still labeling it as primitive and lesser than. So on the one hand, I do think it's important to give credit where it's due. These works were really influential on an art history we're all familiar with. But on the other hand, it kind of just sounds like textbook appropriation. You take the things you want, and then you just label the other people as primitive. Because they couldn't do it on purpose. No, theirs was because they didn't have enough technology. But in the West, it was a conceptual and formal decision that was made quite consciously. The sarcasm is thick, but I think the double standard is pretty clear. In 1911, Alfred Stiglitz, who was another artist, brought Picasso's work to America for one of the first times. He showed it in 291 Gallery, which is kind of an odd name, but it's actually just the numbers of its address on 5th Street. And as we just saw in the previous image, and we see in this one, Picasso was hugely influenced by African art, particularly with masks, fragmentation, and abstraction. Next, moving on to 1914, we see Stiglitz partnering with Marius de Zayas and they're exhibiting some of the first African sculptures as art, rather than as an artifact or some kind of remnant from history. Instead, they're being seen as expressive, aesthetic, conceptual, and cultural works of art in their own right. And in 1923, the Whitney Studio Club, which would later become the Whitney Museum, presents Picasso's paintings alongside African sculptures. While it's amazing that African art is finally being honored as art in itself, this is really recent, which is to say that we're moving in a good direction, but we still have a lot of work to do. Moving forward, we're going to look at contemporary artists. So I've listed quite a few, but keep in mind that Africa is huge. So there are so many other artists that you could find, in addition to just doing more research on these artists that I'm going to present. So first we have this Tunisian painter and video artist, who actually has a PhD in sciences and technology of arts. The work itself focuses on cultural and political themes of media, bigotry, masculinity, and brutality of war. The artist is also comparing the domestic with the public, using objects like TVs or light bulbs, as compared to tanks, guns, and microphones. Next, we have a painter and sculptor from Mali who plays with animal and humanoid figures and embryonic imagery. The work often includes fabrics and layers of detail. Next, we have a Nigerian graphic designer who creates their work by quilling, which is a labor-intensive process where strips of paper or fabric are folded and shaped into a design. And this artwork is dealing with concepts of gender, power, and social structures. We have a Ugandan sculptor, photographer, and designer. This artist often deals with figures and portraiture, often utilizing the lost wax casting method. These are actually from his Imperfection series, which, as the title suggests, celebrate imperfections. Next, we have another Nigerian artist who is working in mixed media and dealing with topics like mental health, utilizing a surrealistic style and symbolism. Yet another Nigerian artist, this is a painter. Formally, the work is concerned with textures, which we can see in these skin tones, and the artist often depicts people in their home doing daily activities. Next, we have a Zimbabwean artist who uses mixed media, primarily painting and sculpture. The artist is inspired by people around her, though she tries to stay away from forms that are explicitly figural. Next, we have a Kenyan Dutch photographer who deals with concepts like grief, loss, and healing. Much of her work actually tells stories of her own life and experiences. For instance, she watched people treat her father poorly after he lost his legs due to an illness, and later she had to deal with the grief of actually losing her father. Next, we have an Angolan mixed media artist who uses materials like paint, textiles, and beads. The artist utilizes fiber arts with techniques like embroidering, sewing, knitting, and crocheting, and often includes objects from daily life. Now we have a Tanzanian painter who has a really minimalist style and focuses mainly on the negative spaces, depicting primarily black women and celebrating their daily lives. This Mozambican sculptor uses assemblages, often including materials like weapons to create a political commentary, and a common theme throughout his work is the use of the throne. This photographer and activist is from South Africa and focuses primarily on portraiture. Conceptually, her work is investigating black and queer identities, particularly in relationship to cultural and political reactions like discrimination and hate crimes. A major so what with this lecture is combating both Western canons and the singular story of Africa. As we're tracking the history of African art, we're seeing its influences in very real ways on art history that it often doesn't get credit for. Yes, Picasso definitely painted that image himself, and I don't honestly think he did anything wrong drawing inspiration from another art form. But it's really plain in the treatment of his abstraction and the treatment of pretty much all African art throughout history and its abstraction that there's a double standard and that African art isn't really given the same respect as Western art, even when they're doing very similar aesthetic and conceptual things. And that is the end of my lecture, so make sure you're staying safe, get enough sleep, and I will see you all in class.